February 22nd, 1942. My month to try to recoup some of my losses is slowly coming to an end, and I'm not quite in the position that I wanted to be in. Whether or not it was bad luck or his reconnaissance, it did allow him to identify the gap in my lines. So one of the first things he did was move troops up into this space. I'm not too worried about this exploitation. The thing that worries me is the fact that for the second week in a row, the 51st Army has been hit with a series of 4 deliberate attacks that has basically reduced 6 divisions to completely depleted status. Other than his concern, the rest of his armies in the area just move up and present themselves a hex away from my lines, which I'm totally fine with. It's the point of me retreating in the manner that I did. There is one small engagement northwest of that supply depot that causes him to rout a single, already beaten up infantry division. In the far south, all the combat continues to be from his mechanized divisions that's sweeping out across the plains northeast of the hills that have now been fully conquered by Axis forces. Other than a couple battles here, he just moves up and takes the terrain that I gifted him. And that pretty much sets us up for what happens on the beginning of my turn on this third week in February. There is some good news, though. Looking at the amount of manpower on the map, it has now reached 4.5 million. I'm trying to get this up to over 5, ideally. The issue is going to come when his spring offensive really starts, because I will probably, once again, start to lose 150, 200,000 men per week. Not looking forward to those days. The AFV, though, on map is stagnated, which is not ideal. That's the one thing that I'm trying to figure out. But the good news is the amount of refits that I've done in my reserve pool. We have 900, I'll call them tanks. They're not all tanks, but we have 900 tanks sitting there ready to come to the map. I'm also happy to see that even with this, my active pulls in the production screen are still fairly high for tanks, so that at least means for the next couple weeks I'll be able to bring more to the reserves where I have several refitting. I also did spend this turn finally building some of those British separate tank battalions, so the Matildas will finally start getting into action since I'm getting 10 a week with that. The artillery is all on the map or in the reserves. So those large pulls of artillery from a couple weeks ago have now finally made their way out of the warehouses and almost to the front line. In the air, with the weather having all the blizzard hexes being much further to the south, this is just normal snow. I decided to do a bombing run. Still a lot of operational losses. I'm alright with that. My Air Force has just been sitting still for the bulk of the winter, so I'm at like over 6,000 airplanes. They're all going to die anyways. The thing I did do differently is the recon. I spread out. Did like individual hexes instead of one big giant square, and telling like it got me a little bit better results. I'm still obviously not seeing what the exact units are, but I'm going to start trying to do reconnaissance in this manner to at least get a better feel for maybe where his units are like kind of coordinated behind the lines. I don't know. I got to try to do something with them. Shifting to the ground forces, the 45th Army is going to disband its depot and retreat a little bit. I'm looking at mostly a 2-hex withdrawal and a new depot up at this next town I'm not going to name. But the Rifle Guards Division has been replenished. It will get a separate tank battalion as well to further bolster its strength. And I have railed down a unit further in the rear. I'm unable to take them off the trains this week, but they'll be available for whatever further withdrawals end up happening as I get into next turn in this area. This is going to be a slow, steady pullback towards the city of Stalingrad. I'm bringing a lot of stuff down to that city, and I've also played with the refit status of the entire map. So for this week, the only divisions that are able to refit are in the city of Stalingrad or in the reserve box. But I'll get to that later. I'm bringing artillery to the actual 45th. And then the 51st is going to sit to the northern edge here, retreating as well. As I said earlier, its divisions have been pretty heavily hit, so a lot of them have been switched back to Stavka. They're going to retreat pretty much to Stalingrad herself and try to spend up probably 4 weeks refitting before they're even ready. They might even go back to the reserve box at one point or disbanded. But the manner that I did with Stalingrad itself, with it being, I have right now 4 armies down there, all under Stavka, all getting ready for what inevitably will be the reserves to replenish this area. They are the only ones on the map that have refit status that are infantry divisions. And the thinking here is that if I make it to where these are the only units that have access to the refit button, then it will force, if I'm getting 100,000 a week, it'll force 60,000 to go to this area, thus making this, what seems like a lot of forces, finally become strong. So I'm going to notice that when I get my turn back, and I'll see whether or not this worked. But this was the idea and the thinking going into this week. Moving down into the Caucasus areas itself, as I said earlier, the retreat's going to continue here. The units on the furthest southern edge of this, on the actual mountain ranges themselves, they're going to stick around. They're going to try to like roll back into the mountains themselves, while the dark blue division, or not division, the dark blue army is going to take its divisions and just continually head eastward, picking up whatever new units I'm moving westward in, just to provide a little bit of resistance as we get into the week by week area. The main real goal here is to provide a line along the mountain range to those forts that are further east of Grozny. I keep calling it Gorky. Of Grozny itself. The army to the north of it, though, has rolled back and headed north towards Stalingrad itself, and it's going to provide the defensive line along the river towards the Caspian Sea. I forget the name of the town that's up there. That I do have a few units racing up to start building fortifications up along that river. But shifting to the commander's report screen, this is all the tank battalions and brigades, with 2 regiments, or 3 rather, sitting in my reserve box. And by funneling it down to everything with above 90% TOE, obviously I'm sitting down here looking at these 5. And with one of them being just created last week, these 4 tank brigades will bring about 164 AFV to the map next week. And then with further focusing on the refits of these, should be able to start to bring a much more steady supply of my production line to the map itself. Artillery is sitting in a very similar situation. Here, though, the main difference is with how many of these units are actually ready for the map. So, I mean, a lot of the artillery coming up and out of the production line poles have finally reached these regiments and brigades and various different types. And just looking at how many guns just up and down that column, when they finally do reach the Stalingrad area, I'm hopeful that this will increase the casualties on the German side. Moving over to the infantry sitting in the reserve box, in a further move to free up more manpower, I've taken a good chunk of these rifle brigades, which would be useful on the map. I do have a few still. I'm going to use them. I'm not disbanding all of them, but this should free up about 20,000 more manpower. Hopefully that with 100,000 will go specifically to the Stalingrad area. Very curious to see if this works out, but I believe it shall. The only other bit of good news that occurred for me this week is up in the Tambov area. I did get a division to hit 8 wins and 1 loss. This turning itself into the 1st Guards Rifle Division. It will fall back and be the only unit with the privilege of refitting that is not in the Stalingrad area. So, it's good news. I'm going to have to do a better job of perusing these units along this line here and seeing if anybody else is close to this. I'm still not quite sure what the threshold is to make it do this on its own, But I did bring the airborne units to the map for next turn because I believe turn 37 is where I can start turning airborne brigades into these Guards Rifle Division with their 55 base morale. So that will help me whenever his spring offensive does begin. And this spring offensive is going to be interesting. But for now, the retreat that I'm doing will continue to save lives. So I do expect to get like another 30,000, 40,000 casualties when he does his attacks, which I'm assuming is going to happen with the 45th Army because it's the closest to his lines. But we shall see.